Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Literacy View. We have a very special guest with us today. Her name is Dr. Danielle Colenbrander, and she is an expert in the area of vocabulary and morphology. And we're going to be discussing the latest research article that just came out in October. So this is breaking news. And the article is entitled The Effects of Morphological Instruction on Literacy Outcomes for Children in English-Speaking Countries, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis. And we love to dive into those. We'll talk about that soon. Dr. Colenbrander's research investigates word reading, spelling, and reading comprehension, assessment, and instruction, with a particular focus on the roles of vocabulary and morphology. With a keen interest in translating research into practice, she has worked closely with teachers and teaching assistants across Australia and the UK. In addition to her research work, Dr. Colenbrander has designed and conducted professional learning workshops for individual schools, school systems, and not-for-profit organizations. She has presented her work at numerous teacher-focused conferences and teacher podcasts, and she is a lecturer for the advancement of literacy at the Australian Centre for the Advancement of Literacy. So welcome, Danielle. We're so happy to have you. And so this is a hot topic now, morphology. And it seems as though we are kind of expanding from basic decoding and phonics types of phonic work into morphology and really expanding into vocabulary and how to expand vocabulary. So could you give us just a nutshell, a summary of what this research is, and then Judy and I could start asking you questions. Why don't we start there?
Sure. So basically, this is a meta-analysis, so a study of studies about how you teach morphology to improve reading and spelling. And so we were really interested in doing this because there's a fair bit of research on morphology out there, and there had been a few previous meta-analyses lumping together a whole lot of studies looking at morphology instruction, but they were quite broad. So they were looking at a really wide age group, so from preschool to grade 8 or preschool to grade 12. And, you know, what you do with a preschooler is very different to what you might do with a primary schooler or what you might do with a high schooler. And also they included all kinds of measures. So they were looking at vocabulary, they were looking at morphological awareness in spoken language, they were looking at reading and spelling. So a whole lot of different things in the one study. And also they were published about 10 years ago now. So a lot of new research has been published. So we thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting to sort of try and bring all this research together again and think about, well, actually, do we have good evidence that teaching morphology actually makes a difference for reading and spelling and reading comprehension? And then beyond that, what can these studies tell us about how you actually teach it? We're more successful with the first aim than the second one, as you might remember from reading the paper, which we'll talk about later, but that's the overview.
I love that you explained what a meta-analysis is, because, you know, we use these terms and some people get very confused, but really what makes this so powerful is you don't just look at one research study. You're looking at a broad look at multiple research studies, which really then strengthens the argument for whatever the results are, because it's not just one study. And so that's important for people to know. Judy, is there a question that you would like to throw out to Danielle first? And then I'll jump in with some of my questions and thoughts. Judy, you're muted.
Oh, so I was at work today And, I look at these articles multiple times before we get on the air. And I wasn't feeling well, as you could see today. And then I printed this article, and it was very long. My printer got jammed. I had to print it again. And I was like, oh my God, Faith picked something that has like 32 pages. And that's very overwhelming for, a teacher or a coach. It's a lot. But I think it's important. And as I read through it, a lot of questions started to go through my mind because it's an area that I'm passionate about. And I think I've gotten really good at teaching kids how to decode, and my teachers have gotten really good at it. And when I go into the classrooms, I see like teachers are focusing more on suffixes. I haven't seen as much on prefixes and that higher level morphology. So it's an area I'm passionate about. And I want to get your recommendations on, so how important is this for kids to become better readers? Can you break down that research a little bit in a more simple way for me as a practitioner in the field? And tell me what might be some great professional next steps for me, as I want, now my teachers are familiar with teaching basic decoding. They're getting better at teaching suffixes. How can we take it to the next level? And will this help our children achieve better outcomes?
Okay, so a lot of things in there, but I think the first thing is, as you say, it's a big article. There's a lot of information in there. And of course, not everybody's got time for that. So I will try and summarize it down as neatly as possible. So basically, just to give you an idea of the scale of it, we started with about 5,000, more than 5,000 abstracts for different studies. And I read them all, every single one myself personally. And then out of that, we came up with about almost 150 papers. And then I and others read those whole papers. And out of those, I think there was about 27 studies that actually made the cut. And then out of those, we picked out all the information on, what was actually being taught, what tests were being used, who the participants were, what, the general details of the study, and then tried to put them together. And when we did that, what we found was there's actually reasonable evidence that teaching morphology does improve children's ability to read words and spell words, but it doesn't actually seem to have any effect on reading comprehension, as insofar as the evidence that we have. So I'll come back to that, but I want to focus on the reading and the spelling.
That's interesting that you mentioned that, because that's what I saw, and I was like, wait a minute, oh my God.
Yeah, so I will come back to that. But just talking about the reading and spelling, one thing I really want to draw attention to is the fact that we looked not only at kind of general reading and spelling outcomes, but we were also really interested in whether children are learning the words that they're actually taught directly, or whether there's any transfer to words that they haven't seen before, because this is often claimed about morphology instruction, that, they're learning some kind of generic morphological skill that they can then apply to any word that they see. Sometimes people think of it like decoding. Once you know your grapheme phoneme correspondences, okay, then you can look at any word or most words and get, if not all the way there, then part of the way there. But morphology it's not exactly the same as that. So what we've found is that you actually do get bigger effects for the words that you actually teach during your morphology lessons. And we found that there wasn't that much evidence of transfer to untaught words for reading aloud, but there was for spelling. And so the reason we think that that might be the case is because with reading, there's actually a few ways you can get to the correct pronunciation of the word. And once you do know how to decode, that's a really powerful way, even for irregular words, to get most of the way with the pronunciation. So you can sound out the word, you get a partially correct pronunciation. Like if you think about the word young, you might decode it and you might go, yeah, young. Oh, it's probably young. And that's called set for variability or mispronunciation correction. That's one way you can get to a word. So morphology may not give you that much more over and above that for reading. It does give you something, but it may not give you that much more. Whereas for spelling, when you have to have all the letters in the words in precise order, it really does give you a boost because the English language, the way spelling works in English, is that it's morphophonemic. So it's not always regular, as you very well know. And actually, sometimes in English spelling, the morphological structure of the words is preserved over and above the regularity of the spelling sound or grapheme phoneme correspondences. So, for example, like if you think of the words kissed or wanted, one ends in a t phoneme and the other ends in a schwa, an sound, and then a d. But we spell them both the same way because that preserves the fact that they are both past tense. And so if you know that, that really helps you to have some kind of principle for spelling words that might otherwise be irregular. And it doesn't work for every single word, but it works for quite a few words in English. But the thing is that you don't get kind of magical transfer. So if there's transfer, it's because you've learned some of the prefixes or the suffixes or the roots or bases that are in that word. And that information helps you to work out from the word that you hear how you might spell it.
So Danielle, I have so many questions about this. So let's start. Well, first, let's clarify what morphology even is. I should have started with that because, there are people listening like, morpho, what? What does that mean?
Faith, I'm really proud of you for being explicit and clear. That's so important.
So
the gradual release is definitely needed for many. So let's go.
So, we're talking about the study of meaningful word parts. And
yes.
That's in its most simple terms. Am I correct, Danielle? I mean, obviously, we could be a little bit clearer, but to me, I always think of meaningful word parts in those simple units that, it creates a meaning to the word.
Yes, so let's go right back to the beginning. You're absolutely right. We probably should have started with this.
Yeah.
So when we talk about meaningful parts, let me give a really simple example. So the word cats has two meaningful parts. Cat, which is the base or the root. Sometimes people say stem. It's very confusing, but I'm going to use the term base today. You can keep using root or stem, but I'm going to use base today. That's the main meaning carrying unit. So cats is about how many cats. And then the S is it's a suffix that goes on the end of the base that tells you there's more than one cat. And that is different from a word like catch, which is only one phoneme different, but it's only one meaningful part. And then if we think of a word like unpacking, that's got three parts. It's got a prefix that goes on the front of the base, which means like not or undo. Pack, which is our base, the main meaning carrying unit, and then the suffix ing or ing, which kind of tells you that it's present continuous tense. So it's a grammatical suffix. You can also have, so most bases can stand alone as words. So like cat or table or adventure or elephant. Those are all single morphemes. They're bases. They can stand alone as words. But you can also get some bases that have to have either a prefix or a suffix or both attached to them in order to form real English words. So one example is spect, which means something like to look or see. We don't really get spect on its own as a word in English, but we get it in spectate, spectacle, inspect, all of which have to do with looking and seeing. And that's a bound base. So there's basically four main types of morphemes. Prefixes that go on the beginning of bases, bases that carry the main meaning, suffixes that go on the ends of bases, and you can have bound bases or free bases. You can also have different kinds of suffixes, but I don't know if do we need that level of detail at this stage?
No, I don't want to overwhelm people, but that I think should clear up what today's topic is. So here's what my question is. You talked about how morphology, there was a clear improvement in spelling, but for reading, not so much. But spelling definitely improves reading. So if you can spell a word, you then can read it, certainly, I would say more fluently, if you could spell it, because you're really getting inside the word. So when you talk about, an improvement in spelling, the meaning combined with having to really get inside the word is going to bump up your reading. Isn't that
That's what I thought. Faith, that's exactly what I was thinking. But it seemed like the article said that there weren't gains in comprehension, which was so confusing to me because the whole concept of when we were, taught about morphology was that it's meaning based. And my assumption was that it was directly going to have an impact on comprehension because if you spell something right and you read something right, that should help you understand. So I definitely need clarification.
Yeah, so let me unpack that. So I think one of the reasons why, so we did see effects of morphology instruction on reading, but what we didn't see was transfer to untrained words. So it can make you better at reading the words that you're trained, but it doesn't seem to really give you that much more of a generic skill that you can apply to new words over and above what you're already doing with your kind of grapheme phoneme correspondence knowledge for reading. But it does seem to do that for spelling. And I think this is something to do with also how hard spelling is as opposed to reading. So there's more room to show improvements in spelling than in reading. So that may have something to do with it. But you're absolutely right that when you spell something, it should improve your reading because it's improving your orthographic representation. So these studies didn't necessarily teach written morphology, and they didn't necessarily do spelling. So the reading outcome measures might not reflect them actually practicing their spelling. It might reflect them practicing spoken language morphology and then reading. So they in those particular studies, they may not have had the opportunity to have the improvement from the spelling to the reading, if that makes sense.
It does, but here's my second part of that. So you mentioned trained and untrained words. So, Judy and I have spoken about this a lot as far as transfer. We're always looking to see whatever we do transfers to whether it's authentic text or something in writing. You're always looking for those generalizations and transfer. So here's my question, because it's a little bit confusing. If you're working with trained words, that's obvious, right? You could, in other words, trained words are the words that the teacher chose to teach the concept. Now, untrained would be, okay, I'm going to throw a word out now, and let's see if the child can apply any of those meaningful word parts to this new word that was not taught. Are we correct so far with that? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. So my question is, if we are trying to improve this transfer ability, does that happen when it's combined with vocabulary instruction and content knowledge? Because that's a study that just came out. Our very good friend, Nate the Great, Nate Joseph, and Katherine Garforth, and two other authors just came out with a meta-analysis that said that strategy instruction for comprehension out of vocabulary and what was it? And this and word work and content knowledge, that pretty much strategy instruction was the most important. The other two showed gains, but when all of them are taught together, you get the most out of it. So would that be something to look at for those untrained words? If we added in these other factors, Danielle, would it boost it for untrained words? Or is that just an assumption? Is it correlation, or would we know?
So yeah, so this is extremely complicated, and I want to separate the reading comprehension side of things from the reading and spelling side of things for now. I will come back to it. But what I want to say with the transfer idea for reading and spelling is that when you teach morphology, there's two things that are happening. One thing is that students are learning the actual morphemes, and they're learning about how morphemes come together. So that's the thing that we think might transfer. But the other thing they're doing is they're really improving the detail in their orthographic representations of those words that you're actually teaching. So that is one really important function of morphology. It actually helps to get those words into the memory. And so when you have the trained words, you've got both of those things happening, which is why it's more, in my opinion, more powerful. You've got the actual learning about how morphology works and the learning about the parts, and you've got the wholes that are being built and sticking in the memory. But then when you've got a word that they've never seen before, if it's got some of those morphemes in that you've taught them, they should have a better chance of being able to, and I'll talk about vocabulary as well, because it's true for vocabulary as well, working out what the meaning is, possibly being able to read it and being able to spell it. They have a better chance of being able to do that if it contains one or all of the parts that they've already been taught. But on the other hand, if you get a word that has none of those parts in it, it's got a completely unfamiliar base, well, why on earth would it help them? There's nothing. So they may develop after a really long time of morphology instruction. And this is one problem with the studies, because none of them are maybe long enough to actually show this far generalization. So that could be a reason why we're not seeing it. But over a really long time, someone could get so good at just understanding morphological structure in a general sense that they might be able to see a word that has totally unfamiliar parts and go, well, it's probably these other parts, and then work it out that way. But that's not as likely as when they actually know a few of the parts in the word. So that's, I think, why we see more effects for trained words than for untrained words, because you have this ability to break it down, you have the learning of the parts, and you have the strengthening of the whole, which makes it more automatic, means you can either produce it more automatically for spelling or retrieve it more automatically for reading or understand it more automatically. So teaching morphology, it's a lot about the parts, but ultimately what you want is, you do want the wholes. You want some transferable skill, but really you actually want these particular words to be learned because that's what you read. That's what you understand. That's what you spell.
Yeah. So I can tell you that I was just talking about this today with a principal and teachers, all about what you just said. So Judy's holding up her cheers button. Judy, unmute.
Let's do it, Faith.
Cheers. Big cheers. So, Judy, as I'm listening to Danielle talk, I'm thinking about you coaching with a core reading program. So, in New York City, Danielle, they have 3 core programs that they can choose from. And all of them, have, I'm sure, positives and negatives, and there's a lot of controversy about these programs. So Judy works with one of the core programs. We don't have to say the name of it, but it's one of the 3. What my question is for you, Judy, is any of this type of work that Danielle is talking about, is it included in your core program? Any morphology included? And if not, is that something that needs to be supplemented if it's not part of the core program? Like, are prefixes and suffixes part of this core program? Are base, what's part of it?
All right. So for the early years, most of the schools that I have seen in the field have decided to supplement with a different program for foundational skills. So although the programs that, there's the 3 choices, most of the schools that I know have opted into using a supplement, whether it be foundations or really great reading, or I've seen some schools choose UFly. But then for the upper grades, like for grades 3 through 5, I don't coach those grades. They are using the components that are included in the core curriculum to teach those skills. I think that overall, I think teachers are really still learning the foundational skills and how to teach those basic concepts really well. And I see a massive improvement citywide in teaching kids how to decode. There's so much positive things going on. I think vocabulary instruction is included in these programs. I do see it, but I don't know if it's at that intense level of, really connecting it as well as it could be to the text that kids are reading. And I think that's really important. Otherwise, it becomes such an isolated piece of work. And that's my concern. And I also see right now, and I was just emailing Faith about an hour ago, I see a lot of pushback from unions right now and concerns about the demands on teachers and, forcing teachers to do certain things. So it frightens me. At the same token, I got an email today from Lucy Calkins. Everybody at the Department of Education, I don't know how she got our emails, but she's pushing her agenda again. So I think it's really frightening. It's really confusing.
Time to take a drink here.
Oh, yeah, I said the name. It's just really confusing. I just am concerned because I was telling Faith before, and I know I'm going a little bit off the record, but, state tests are coming up again, right? They're going to come in April. And I think that kids are making gains. Change takes time. But the honest truth is that even with implementing these new core curriculums, test scores went down this year. And I feel like we're going to look at those test scores again this year, and they might not be where we want them to be yet, because all of this implementation science is just evolving, and change takes time. And, it's going to take a couple of years till we possibly get the results that we want. And my concern is, are we going to get pushback? And are people going to be like, we want Lucy back? We want those programs back.
Well,
Balanced literacy was working better. I'm really worried, Faith. I'm going to tell you, I'm really worried.
it could be, and I want Danielle to respond, but to kind of bring us back to morphology. I think these core programs, Danielle, are overloaded with so much. And I guess my question to Judy was, is it included? And are teachers actually doing it? Because when they have so many different choices.
So many different choices, so much to squeeze into their literacy block, making strategic decisions on how to prioritize. And also a lot of these programs, they're partially scripted. They're not fully scripted. So teachers now have to figure out, how do I make sure the gradual release is explicit? It doesn't even say it in there. How do I make sure I'm prioritizing the things that are most important? And I think it's becoming like, what is that word? Piecemealing. Taking a piece here and taking a piece there. And do I include the vocabulary? Do I not include the vocabulary?
So let's hear what Danielle has to say, because this, I think, is so important to so many teachers out there.
Okay, so one thing I'm thinking is that I totally hear you about the overwhelm and the sheer volume of stuff that you have to do. And we have the exact same problem here, because we've had a new curriculum coming in. Teachers have to learn a whole lot of new information. It is really overwhelming, and it does take a lot of time. And I think there's a lot of different voices out there saying, you have to do this, and you have to do that, and you have to do the next thing. I am not qualified to comment on every single part of that, but I will say something about morphology, and that is, sometimes people really get carried away with it. So sometimes you see things where, you know, people are spending hours and hours teaching morphology and, you know, delving right deep into the most detailed aspects of English morphology and etymology. And look, if you've got the time and the expertise, that's fantastic. But if you don't have the time, then the most important thing is which morphemes are going to get the kids where they need to be for the reading they need to do and the spelling they need to do. And there are some scope and sequences out there, and none of them are perfect, and all of them are slightly different. But I think that a really good exercise is to actually look at a couple of them and see which ones overlap. And I would say, so there's kind of two sources of evidence for morphology instruction. The one is, of course, those training programs, which we analyzed in our meta-analysis, or not training programs, I should say, training studies. And the other is the nature of the English language and what kind of words students will be exposed to at different ages. And if we bring that together, it's still very fuzzy. There's still a lot that we don't know, but we can give you some sort of general guidelines, the kind of stuff that's absolutely crucially important. So like
where will I find that?
I'll send you some links of some useful things to look at. But I don't think there's anything perfect, but I think it's worth looking at a couple, and I'll send you some links. But basically what I would say in the very beginning, like in kindergarten and grade 1, when kids are just learning to read, they need to understand some really basic things like, first of all, they need to know the difference between a vowel and a consonant. Because they can't understand how morphological spelling changes work unless they understand what vowels and consonants are. I'll come back to that. They need to just have the general idea of what is a morpheme in very simple words. And then you could start teaching them the most basic grammatical morphemes because, you know, when they're in grade 1, they're not going to come across a lot of words with many morphemes in them when they're reading. They mostly will see plural S, singular, third person singular S, ing, past tense ed. Then as you go on, you move on to other frequent prefixes and suffixes that are really concrete and that you see a lot in lots of different words, very frequent, like un or pre, or er for teacher is a great one, for example. And then you gradually move up in complexity. And things like bound bases, the students, you know, lots of people might disagree with me, but I think students don't really need them until end of grade 2, grade 3. But at that point, they start becoming quite useful for academic words.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like give examples, please.
Yes. So I'm talking about things like geo in geography, things like, as I said, spect in inspection. Let me see if I can give you some more examples.
May I jump in, Danielle? So bound, think about it. You can't have the word without it being bound to something else. So,
yes.
So struct cannot stand alone. It's not a free morpheme. So free means it could stand by itself.
Yeah.
Bound means it has to be attached to something to be a word.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. And there's other ones like DICT, meaning to speak or say, like predict or dictation, RUPT or rupt, meaning something like to break, like in disrupt or interrupt. Those sorts of things are pretty useful for helping you remember the spellings of those often irregular words. And then those, but you don't really need to spell those words until you get to in a grade 2, grade 3 and older. So that's when it makes sense to introduce them. So you don't need to start in kindergarten and be like, oh my gosh, they have to learn everything about morphology and they have to know all the morphemes. Just a little bit, and just the most frequent and the most useful ones.
Danielle, why do I see suffixes so much more than prefixes in the early childhood bracket?
Well, I think it might be because there are more of them, but also because I think if we're thinking actually from a spelling perspective, I don't know if this is why people do it, but spelling changes sometimes occur to bases when you add suffixes to words. So it is actually, that doesn't happen when you add a prefix. It doesn't change the front of a base. So that is a reason why you see more of them. But I think there are just generally more suffixes. So maybe that's why.
So,
but they do, I was going to say, but they do need to learn about both prefixes and suffixes.
Yeah, so I also think in language, wouldn't you say that kids start using suffixes before prefixes in language? Even when they're speaking, they're saying words like walking, or they learn to use past tense or plural. So, I mean, even today I was teaching a lesson and we were talking about the aw sound and the different spellings for aw, and the word pause came up. Now, it could be pause, like to pause the TV, to stop it, or it could be having more than one paw, P-A-W, more than one. And right away, I brought in the idea of the morpheme, that we're talking about more than one, and that's going to impact the spelling, and to see the difference between the two as opposed to just to pause the TV. So even without doing a lesson, right, it comes up. If you're doing even a good phonics lesson, you are going to put in some of this type of work. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So it doesn't always have to be an extensive lesson, as you say. And I think when you're doing phonics and you're building your morphology into your phonics, that is a natural place to start introducing some of these things as the words come up that have these morphological complexities. And then once they've seen it, then as you're reading a book, you can be like, hey, look, there's that word again.
I want to give you a cheers, and I think that's an important piece. I always stress to my teachers, you don't want to do these things in isolation. You have to show kids that it's actually happening in authentic text. So if you're using a different phonics program, but then you're using a different core program, make that connection for kids. Kids very often don't naturally, some kids do, but some don't make that connection naturally. And that's our job, is to help them transfer that information and see it not only for a half hour, but for their entire literacy block. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. And I have to come back to the point you were making before about vocabulary being done in isolation from text. No, but that's not what we suggest. You know, I'm not a fan of having a list of vocabulary words that is separate from the books, because, you know, you can't teach all words. And again, what words they need to know? The ones they have to use. And the ones they have to use are in the books that you read to them and in the content that you teach them. And that's the place to look for the words. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, you know, oh my gosh, I've got to find 45 minutes in my day for this completely isolated vocabulary. You do need to spend a little bit of time on teaching the words, otherwise kids won't remember them. But it can be connected to the other instruction that you do. And they have to use the words as well in their writing later on as well to remember them.
So talking about the connection, like you mentioned in the article, this multi-component instruction, right? So if we're talking about something that's multi-component, this goes back to what we mentioned before about the strength of doing these things together as opposed to separately.
Yes.
So could you give an example, perhaps, of what teachers can walk away with after this conversation as far as what multi-component would look like, with the emphasis being tying in morphology, that type of work, with vocabulary, because those two are tied,
Yes.
tightly, with content knowledge and with strategy work? Like, what would be a good example for people so they walk away understanding this?
Okay, that's a hard question, but I'll do my best. So for the reading and spelling side of things, when I'm talking about multi-component, what I mean is your phonics instruction, a little tiny bit of irregular word instruction, and then a little bit of morphology. So in the very beginning, it's mostly going to be grapheme phoneme correspondence instruction with a little bit of morphology and a couple of sight words that you really need to be able to get your texts together. And then the next year, slightly more morphology, slightly less grapheme phoneme correspondences, and then you really start focusing on your spelling more, and then your writing. In the reading comprehension side of things, this comes back to what you were saying before about the generalization, the transfer, why we didn't get it with morphology, these morphology studies. Because, as you know, reading comprehension is so complicated. And there's all these different levers that you need to move to get it to change. But the very basic thing is over time, students need to be able to, it's not basic at all actually, but students need to be able to read fluently and accurately so they can quickly access the information in the text. They need to be able to understand the meaning of the words in the text. They need to be able to put it together to form ideas. And then they need to be able to use that information. So to kind of get to the point where they can do that, you need the word level stuff, which I talked about, but you also need vocabulary instruction, which includes talking about the morphology of the words. They need to learn about, they need a little bit of strategy instruction, and I say just a little bit, in the context of text. So very focused on the language of the text and what to do if you misunderstand, where to look for extra information in the text if you misunderstand. I'm not talking about empty routines, memorizing complicated strategies. That takes a huge amount of time and a huge amount of mental energy. Your focus always has to be on the text. In terms of background knowledge, having sustained units where children are reading text related to the same information and where this is connected to their kind of content area instruction as well. So having kind of topics where they build knowledge over time on that particular topic and talk about what they're reading and reason about what they're reading. And then they also need to do some sentence level work, so understanding complex sentences. But I think at the heart of it, it's really about the topics you choose, how those are related to what you need to achieve based on what the syllabus tells you they have to learn.
I know I asked you a complicated question, but the reason I'm asking is because you had said, you and the other researchers mentioned that you don't really have a time, like how much time do you give morphology? And, that's not clear. And then you said also, I forget exactly where I saw this, but it was like you laid out what we don't know. We don't know how much time to give it. We don't know how long. We have unanswered questions as far as some of
it. That's funny that you say that. And that's the hard part with research, right? We go in wanting to believe something so badly, and then when you read it, it's almost like you're reading a romance novel, and what you fantasized and thought might not actually be true, or the answers that you were looking for might not be there. So it's almost like you want to put your head down, go to sleep, and like say, oh man. And that's how I felt a little bit. And then I was like, okay. And then social media makes you feel like morphology is where it's at, right? All these new books are coming on the market, and then you have to start thinking, is this the book that I should buy? Morpheme Magic, and then another morpheme book is coming out. And then we also had a guest on, Bruce Howlett, who actually I know deeply said that morphology is such a key component, right, Faith? If I remember correctly.
He was talking about multi-component instruction. And so it was one of the factors, but I think it's Danielle.
But he said that it was really like, that was what I walked away from. Like, this is like a big bang for your buck. This is a priority. But then I read this and I know it's still important, but I kind of feel like, is it as important as I thought Should I be investing all my time and energy in it? Should I be buying the new books that are coming on the market, or should I just take it a step back and like?
I think when it comes to reading comprehension, morphology alone is no way going to be the lever on its own that moves anything. No way. It's just one part. It's a small part. So it's an important part, and it attaches to another important part, which is vocabulary. But there's no one thing, and that's the problem. There's no one thing that is going to get you that bang for your buck. And I guess what I was trying to say before, maybe wasn't explaining so well, is that what you need is accumulation of knowledge and information over time. It's over time. So it must be completely overwhelming to be like, oh, I have to teach all of this. It is overwhelming, but you can't teach everything. And there's always going to be a compromise. So I think the kind of principles for decision making there would be, okay, what's the kind of content area knowledge that we are sort of required to teach in this year? How can we link this to the requirements for reading comprehension? And then use that to kind of choose your texts and put them into topics. And then you do lots of reading and talking about text. And in addition to the lots of reading and talking about text, you do a bit of strategy instruction in relation to the text, and you do your vocabulary and your morphology instruction. Again, in relation to the words in the texts. That's the best advice I can give, I guess.
And I think what you're saying is it's important. It's important. Yeah. And what we're seeing is it definitely shows strong outcomes for spelling. It's, and certainly for the trained words that it's important. And certainly if we see certain base words come up and different word components, hopefully there will be some transfer involved if it's taught deeply and in this manner. Here's my question to you. You mentioned Pete Bowers in the article, and not everybody knows who he is, but I certainly do. And there's some controversy about what he believes in terms of morphology and what you discovered in your research. Could you talk a little bit about that, please?
Okay, getting right to the heart of it. See?
Yeah, this is a no BS zone. So I'm ready to call BS on some of the things that I've heard before, but I'll let you say it and then I'll press my BS button.
So Faith, you're getting spicy tonight.
So full disclosure, I have worked with Pete and I've worked with his brother. That was one of my first, his brother Jeff, that was one of my first jobs after I finished my PhD. And I was involved in rolling out structured word inquiry. So what Pete Bowers has done is he's come up with a method of teaching morphology and etymology called structured word inquiry. And it's very inquiry based and it doesn't have a strict scope and sequence. Basically, it kind of really aims to teach children a deep knowledge of the morphological system of English. And I will tell you about my own experiences of trying to help teaching assistants roll this out because I think it's pretty revealing. So what we did was we ran a study comparing structured word inquiry to a different instructional method that didn't focus on the parts underneath the words. It focused more on the whole words and text experience. And so I was in 12, 13 schools, this was in the UK, trying to help teaching assistants roll out structured word inquiry. So they had some training from Pete for 3 days, and then they had some lesson plans from us. So it wasn't like we just asked them to just go and do anything they wanted. They did have lesson plans. And I was in the schools very frequently with the teachers trying to help them do this. And I saw how difficult it is to deliver this kind of instruction because you need a really deep knowledge of morphology and etymology. Because, if you come across a word and a child asks you, I'm interested in this word, and you look into that word, sometimes it's a frequent word with frequent prefixes and suffixes and bases, and you'll know it and great. And other times you're like, oh, I've got no idea. And you have to look it up. And English morphology and etymology, sometimes it's useful. Some of it is I guess predictable, but some of it is quite obscure. And you don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time looking at that. So these teaching assistants, they found it pretty hard. It was a really steep learning curve for them, and it took a long time. And that is my concern with something that is very open-ended and doesn't have a strict scope and sequence. And I think if you have an expert who's teaching it, somebody who's really good at it, they can achieve incredible things. But not everyone has time to develop that incredible depth of knowledge. And then we also have to question, how much extra bang for your buck are you getting from that kind of really deep, intense focus versus thinking about the most frequent and useful and predictable ones that the kids are going to see in lots of words. So I think you can sort of tell what side of the line I lie on. I really think very pragmatically about what's going to be most useful and what's kind of manageable for a really busy teacher. There's very little research actually comparing this SWI approach to a different approach. So, it's quite a bit of a question mark. But I think from a practical perspective, whether or not we need to go into that very, very deep knowledge of morphology, I'm not sure that it's necessarily going to give you more bang for your buck.
So my feeling with all this is, you started off by saying for young kids, most of the time should be spent on connecting grapheme and phonemes, right? The correspondences.
Yeah, on the reading side of things. On the vocabulary side, you could talk about in oral language.
Yes, I'm talking about like figuring out words that basically they need to understand basic phonics. And so I don't think that the Bowers believe in that. They think you could solve everything through morphology without really doing some basic synthetic.
Faith, what's in your hand?
A BS button. So I think I'm going to press it now, not for you, but that doesn't fly with me. So sorry. I have to call BS when I see it. So and from what your study shows, that there really isn't much to that as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I really want to say I have a huge amount of respect for Jeff and Pete and for what they do. And when you see,
I think it's excellent work, excellent. But I'm talking about the part that says that we don't really have to start with basic phonics, that you can kind of jump in and teach kids and avoid that. That's the part I'm talking about.
Yes.
I think the work that they do is amazing as far as the morphology, the work and inquiry, and I think it's excellent. And like you said, for somebody who already has deep knowledge of this, they could really work this. But the thought of avoiding, like synthetic phonics, the basics, I don't think there's much to that. That's
I would agree with you. And I think basically, well, it's about giving kids the information to crack the code, the information that enables them to go off and become independent readers as quickly as possible, because there's nothing like practice. The faster you become a good and capable reader, the more reading you do, the more information you're exposed to, the faster and better you become. You have to get them there as quickly as possible. And doing that in an organized and systematic way is going to get you there faster. So ultimately, yes, I think you do need that.
Judy, any last thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I think this was excellent. I think it clarified a lot for me. It made me feel a little bit better that I'm not a morphology queen at this point. I'm still getting kids to read. I shared with Faith, I was working with a student today after work, and the child is completely fluent. And a couple of months ago, that child wasn't. So even without my deep expertise in morphology, which I do want to get better at, I think I'm okay. And I think that for the teachers out there, you know, embrace where you are on your journey, you know what's important. The foundational skills is a great place to start. And I think that Danielle sharing those resources, and we'll be having them in our show notes, might be really a great starting point for many of us. And no, that's about it. I want to thank everybody, and definitely follow us on Facebook, The Literacy View, Real Teachers Letting Loose. Join our group. And we're also going to the World Literacy Summit, so we hope that some of you will join us in England in April. And subscribe to our channel, subscribe to our YouTube. You can now donate to the Literacy View, and we want to thank the people that have donated to what we're doing here. And also, you could advertise with the Literacy View, so go on theliteracyview.com. Thank you so much.
Danielle, is there anything that we missed that you would like to add to the conversation, or as a wrap up, just as far as leaving people with some last thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think that the message I'm getting is that morphology can be overwhelming when you start learning about it, and you don't need to feel that you need to know every single thing about morphology. I don't know every single thing about morphology. I'm constantly discovering new things. But if you start from the perspective of looking at a couple of scope and sequences, looking at what you see in common across those, that's going to be a good indication of the important things to teach. And then, start with the basics, integrate it with what you're already doing with phonics, and then you can also talk about the morphological structure of words in books that you come across. If you're able to start doing that, your knowledge will grow. You will integrate this into what you're already doing, and I think that that's the best thing you can do.
Thank you so much. This was fabulous. When you're very humble when you said, you're still learning, and of course we're all learners, but I think we got probably an expert here sharing all the information we need. Thank you for breaking it down, and we definitely appreciate when we have a researcher who can do that. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great to answer your questions, and I always love to hear teachers' questions because that really drives what I want to research in the future. So thank you.
Thank you.